of the Southern Workers Assembly Study Group on the Southern Key. Uh, just a reminder, we are lucky to have the author of this incredible book with us, Mike Goldfield. And before we turn it over to him, I just want to share some, I guess, housekeeping rules, primarily of participation from those on Zoom. While, it's important to hear what he has to say, to hear the lessons. As he's talking, think about how some of what is shared relates to your workplace today. Think about questions. Put the questions in the chat. And I'm already glad to see a lot of people have their cameras on. Feel free to turn your camera on. Feel free, to not put the question in the chat, but to ask it for the entire Zoom to hear. We want to maximize participation, and also reiterate that this is a study group, a reflection, a look at this incredible work for one real sole purpose only, to use it to inform our organizing in the present. So really taking the past, these lessons, and really dealing with what it means for us today. So welcome again. We're going to get started, and I'll turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Ajmal. Okay, can people see the whoop? Let me see if I can get this.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so this is the second part. I'm going to talk about associative power. Last week, we talked about the coal miners and the type of leverage that they had. Associative power comes from the support of various allies in one struggle. These allies can be other workers and unions, outside groups, racial, ethnic, or immigrant organizations, students, community activists, political organizations, or other forces. So all workers gain additional power from having broader support. Something that a lot of unions don't recognize today, and even some didn't recognize during the 1930s. Some groups, however, need this support much more than others. For those workers without a large amount of structural leverage, or can be easily replaced like textile workers were during the 1930s and 1940s, associational power is essential. So some of the key events, and I'm going to start with broader ones and then move to the South. The Toledo Autolite strike, and Autolite was a supplier for automobiles in Detroit. Toledo is probably less than an hour's drive from Detroit. The workers went on strike. The company got an injunction. The workers violated it. The National Guard was called out, and 30,000 people from the unemployed organization in the county showed up. That was the associational power. They fought the guard to a standstill, kept scabs from coming into the plant. In Minneapolis, another important strike in 1934, the Teamsters stopped all the trucks. They were chased by police. They murdered a couple strikers, and this 100,000 people from all over the Midwest, but certainly all over Minnesota, showed up to the funeral march. And this is a picture from the funeral march. Other events, similar events were taking place throughout the South. The unemployed movement, Birmingham was clearly one of the main centers, but also Chattanooga, Atlanta, Richmond, Virginia also had massive amounts of organizing going on. So this is a picture of 7,000 people in Birmingham outside the courthouse. And one interesting thing when I've looked at these pictures, and I talked to my father who participated in some of this stuff and is long gone, I said, when I see these pictures, everybody's wearing suits. and women are dressed up fancy. I said, when we had these demonstrations during the civil rights movement and later, none of us looked like this. He said, well, if people just had one nice pair of clothes, that's what they wore for a demonstration, even if they were going to be fighting the police. So other people, farmers, sharecroppers, and tenants, often with little leverage, were inspirational. So in Alabama in particular, sharecroppers engaged in gun battles with sheriffs, with vigilantes. And even though their victories were small, it was inspirational for people in the city who saw sharecroppers willing to stand up and risk their lives. This was very important in the South. On the West Coast, longshore workers, as in the South, also had a lot of leverage, but they still got a lot of support from woodworkers and unemployed organizations. And as in those couple pages, in addition to the social movement chapter that I asked people to read, woodworkers who had had difficulty organizing were inspired by the longshore strike and organized. And this is a page, I don't know how much of this you can see, the timber worker, and the center of the lumber industry was in Aberdeen, Washington. This is from 1937. So the woodworkers here raised food for the sit-down strikers in Detroit. They also helped, can you see where my arrow is on here? Maybe not. In the middle, above the picture, it says Grays Harbor Beauticians have organized. For beauticians to have organized, it requires a lot of outside support. And so there was a lot of synergy between people who didn't have much leverage and people who had more leverage. In Alabama, as we talked about last time, workers organized wall to wall. Gadsden was an important industrial center and became fully unionized. In 1947, Gadsden had 60,000 people, 10,000 CIO members, 3,000 of whom were female. And we'll talk about what unions did do and didn't do next week during Operation Dixie with respect to women. But in 1947, several hundred workers at the Star Laundry struck, almost all women. The company fired most of them and hired scabs. Union workers in Gadsden mobilized. Steel workers, rubber workers, textile workers placed a mass picket of several thousand people in front of the laundry, forcing the company to capitulate. So a clear case of associative power carrying the day. Now, I don't have this labeled. I forget where this, I think this picture is a more recent picture. I don't know, not that recent, but of from Chattanooga, where people are supporting the farm workers strike. So unions have not always been willing and ready to support mobilizations of workers. So one of the key failures, in my opinion, to use associative power was in Caterpillar in Peoria, Illinois of 1992, where the Caterpillar, the largest construction company in the world, wanted to break the union. I was not that long away from the plant, and so many of the people I was friends with, particularly in the Chicago area, were ready to go down to Peoria and support the workers there. And they were organizing carpools, and the union put a stop to it. They were defeated, but if many thousands of workers from around the Midwest and other parts of the country had gone down to Peoria, it would have been a big help. And this I regard almost as tragic. So in 2011, the longshore industry was trying to get rid of union jobs in Longview. And they were putting a lot of pressure on the union. The ILWU, the International Longshore Workers Union, was a supposed radical union. And this may be before some people's time, but the Occupy movement spread around the country, and its biggest and most militant sector was in the Oakland, California area. So as many as 30,000 people in Oakland mobilized, and Oakland is one of the major ports in the West Coast, and shut down the port. So this is a picture. The media was upset that these workers had done this, and the union, rather than accepting their support, denounced Occupy, which I think was tragic, because this Occupy demonstration, which shut down the port, was supported by the union that was being crushed in Longview, and also by the San Francisco Local 10, which was historically the most militant and civil rights-oriented local in the union. So these, in my opinion, were missed opportunities to use associative power to help them. There have been some successes. Here's one from Mississippi, not talked about that much, but catfish farming became big in Mississippi. Mississippi's the center for catfish farming. For people, those of us who are older, catfish used to be considered this garbage food, bottom feeders in streams, and that only poor people ate. And then it switched as they started farming it to becoming a delicacy. Mississippi was the center for this. The biggest company there, Delta Pride, which this article says is the General Motors of catfish processing. I think now they'd say it's the Toyota of catfish processing. And the workforce was overwhelmingly single Black mothers. The workers were getting $4.30 an hour, which was the minimum wage at the time. Supervisors stood over them with stopwatches, making sure that they cleaned 15 fish a minute, as this article says. And you can look for this article on the internet if you're really interested in knowing more about it. The other thing is supervisors time people going to the bathroom and bathroom breaks. They stood there with stopwatches. So the workers rebelled, but they also mobilized not only the workers in the plant, but the community around them. And as with the Amazon plant in Alabama, these were places with high unemployment, and the city fathers in these overwhelmingly Black towns had encouraged the businesses to come there and were reluctant to criticize them. The workers at the plant forced the political leaders in Indianola and all the surrounding communities to come out in favor of the catfish workers and demanded that they speak at rallies. So they mobilized political elites, which didn't happen in Amazon outside of Birmingham. I think that the leaders who had gotten the Amazon to build their warehouse there were pretty mute during the campaign. So there's an example how associative power was used. Let me go back. Another one was the Toyota plant in Georgetown, Kentucky. The UAW auto workers took a very tepid approach, but construction workers, not considered that radical, but they were fairly militant, banded together, had big demonstrations, mobilized communities, and forced Toyota to accept that the plant would be built and serviced with only union construction jobs, which of course, construction companies that want to hire non-union labor denounce them, but the mobilization trumped that. Certain struggles that don't necessarily have a lot of leverage become inspirational. The Starbucks workers, for example, And one interesting thing about Starbucks workers, so not just Starbucks workers, but teachers, postal workers are spread out throughout the country. They're not concentrated in one, specific geographical area. Postal workers used to be more ubiquitous before the internet, and when money checks had to be sent by mail and couldn't be sent digitally. And so everybody knew a postal worker. Everybody knows, if you have kids, everybody knows teachers. And Starbucks has become ubiquitous too. There's hardly a place in the country. Well, last time I was in Mississippi, I didn't see Starbucks in the rural areas, but aside from that, it's everywhere. People who are working often go into Starbucks because they know it's efficient and they can get a quick cup of coffee as opposed to waiting someplace, right? So the fact that these workers are organizing all around the country, including across the South, is inspirational. And when you go into a Starbucks, you see how fast people work and the assembly line procedures and whatnot. The other thing that's inspirational and where there's more leverage, I mentioned school teachers, but the fact that school teachers were organizing in so-called red states. This is West Virginia, and I don't have a picture here, but some of these signs the school teachers had are reminiscent of the types of slogans that coal miners had. It may be their parents or grandparents were involved. There's hardly any coal mining anywhere, including in West Virginia. In Oklahoma, 3,000 teachers occupied the state capitol, demanding smaller classrooms and more money and whatnot. In Chattanooga, during the campaign at Volkswagen, teachers mobilized and appeared on picket lines and supported workers. This is a picture of Chattanooga teachers who have a sign saying, "We stand with the UAW." And there's a little sign up here that says, "Readers are leaders." So how do you combine structural and associational power? So it's interesting if you look at some of the descriptions I have in the book, how the steelworkers organized. Steelworkers had a lot of structural power, but the companies were big and powerful. Historically, steel companies had divided workers by race and ethnicity, immigrants against non-immigrants. So the steel workers got large-scale support from the National Negro Congress, which was a broad coalition of civil rights organizations, fairly radical. The International Workers Order was also a coalition and a conglomeration of ethnic and immigrant workers. They had halls in steel towns and elsewhere. Many of the steel towns, including Birmingham, which was a steel center at the time, had an unemployed organization. Steel workers set up in-plant groups, so they had an inside and outside strategy. They captured company unions from the inside, and they developed a fair amount of community support, including church support in various places. Auto workers were in a very repressive situation. In many auto plants, they spent throughout the 20s having 6, 8, 10 people in a group, secretly distributing newsletters that publicized grievances and trying one by one to expand their networks of cadre. In 1936, 1937, sit-down strikes took place. They got a lot of support from outside the plant. And the first auto sit-down before Flint, which is the most famous one, took place at the GM plant in Atlanta. So clearly Southern workers were not adverse to organizing on a militant way. So in Atlanta, GM auto workers seized the plant and were to recognize the union. So what are the lessons for today? Let me go back. So that's the open question that I have. So I think I'm going to end my remarks right now, and feel free to ask questions both about the history, but also anything that people want to discuss about how this might be relevant for today.
And feel free to put the questions in the chat, but also it is encouraged for you to come off mute, turn your camera on, and engage with questions in that way too. The floor is open.
So what year were the Catfish and the Toyota strikes that you had the articles from?
Pardon?
You had the slide with the articles from the Catfish strike and the Toyota strike. What years were those?
I think that the Catfish organizing was in 1989 or 1990 in Mississippi. Perhaps recent. The Georgetown thing was a little later. I think the plant was being built in the early 90s, and Toyota originally hired a Japanese non-union construction firm, and they were recruiting for non-union construction workers around, not just in Kentucky, but in other states in that part of the country. The UAW refused to have any demonstrations, said they wanted to get along with the company. The construction workers mobilized environmental groups saying that this non-union approach was degrading the environment in that part of Kentucky, and were not taking relevant environmental and safety approach to what was being done. They had demonstrations in Washington. They got the support of all the national construction unions. There are 16 unions involved here. And they got promises from other, from the state and from other surrounding states that no workers in any of the unions would be involved in building the plant until the company settled. And so they got not only the right to build the plant, but that only unionized workers would be involved in servicing the plant. So for those of you who are familiar with the insides of these plants, there are certain types of construction workers. There's electricians and plumbers and whatnot, but there's also other types of skilled workers that you don't see in construction. There's millwrights who move machinery, there's tool makers, etc. And they got the right to have all these workers have to be in the union in order to work there. And the Toyota plant remains non-union in terms of productive workers today. So, we'll see whether the current UAW is able to take a more militant and successful. I mean, militancy doesn't always win, but certainly laying flat on your back doesn't tend to get people anywhere.
There's a question in the chat here. What issues were there between unions and community groups in sharing power and decision making? Unions usually feel because they bring more resources, they get to decide. Yeah, I had a similar question to kind of build on that. Really, the role of the community. What did that support look like during this period in terms of mobilization, but also in terms of some day-to-day stuff, or that kind of thing? What were some of the strong community elements there?
So if we step back, I can tell you what the coal workers did in Alabama. So Alabama had restrictions on the franchise, right? You had to there was poll taxes. There were registrars who asked all sorts of crazy questions about the state constitution. So the union, and these were discriminatory against working class people in general, but more so among African Americans. So the union sent, and they got support from African American newspapers in Birmingham and other civil rights organizations, and they sent integrated groups of coal miners, black and white, to register, and sometimes they even had a lawyer with them. And they succeeded in Birmingham in getting some percentage of people registered. And they didn't have complete registration. I mean, this was mostly a demonstration effect. But they mobilized people within Birmingham. So they had external activities, and this was typical of what, and the mine workers were not a particularly left-wing unions. Most of these type of activities were engaged in by more left-wing unions. So one union that's been written about is the farm equipment workers. So in Louisville in the late 40s, well before the emergence of the main civil rights movement, they were sending large groups of workers to parks, to swimming pools, and sitting in at hotels to get them to open up racially. So, and these external activities involve people from the community. The same thing, the longshore local that I mentioned in San Francisco, one of the issues was that the public transportation system, the drivers on the buses were all white. And the union forced the company to hire a small number of black bus drivers. And these people were initially attacked. So the union put half a dozen longshoremen, these big burly guys who were lifting these 100-pound things, on the buses with each of the with each of the black bus drivers. And this pretty much stopped the violence. So there was community involvement. The construction workers in Georgetown had coalitions with community groups. And when these plants were being built, while the propaganda from the company and the state was all positive, groups were concerned that with all the tax incentives given to these auto companies, particularly Toyota in Georgetown, that there wouldn't be enough money to pay for schools, that the road system would become clogged up, and the state was not committed to expanding and improving the transportation system. So we're talking about a plant with 8,000 people, with families and whatnot. And this is a big influx of population for a semi-rural type of area. So with the construction workers, there was community involvement. I'm not absolutely sure about the decision-making procedures. I mean, most of these things take place informally and coalition basis, and I'm sure that many of the groups didn't have any type of democratic structure, I mean, including the community groups. But And the union, of course, the unions had reasons to do this to broaden their associative power and put leverage on the companies. I mean, I don't know if that fully answers the question, but these are, sort of complex situations, right?
Yeah, thank you. We have a hand, Zaina.
Thanks, Ajamu. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. I did have a question. So I organize with construction workers down in South Florida that are not represented by a union, unfortunately, though they'd like to be, and we'd like that too. And something I'm curious about in the organizing we do, in your experience or in your sort of historic reading, were there examples of construction workers and then the permanent workers that would be taking the jobs when the project was finished, those unions actually sort of having a coordinated strategy? So let's say that the plant workers, the UAW, were they advocating for the construction workers and vice versa? Did you see that kind of collaboration? And then my other question is, I'm really curious about the tenant and labor collaboration. If you saw examples of tenants, and I'm particularly interested in construction workers, but any of the unions in kind of substantive coordinated collaboration.
On your second question, I'm not sure what you're referring to when you said tenants.
Renters, people who are going to live in housing.
Yeah, so I'm not sure. I mean, clearly housing is an issue whenever there's a huge influx of workers or population. And I should know more about this. I had a student actually at Wayne State who did a dissertation on union avoidance of transplants. In other words, plants, foreign companies that, and she also examined in detail the construction workers. So there's an overlap between what happens in the construction workers in the outside who are building the plant and the construction work and the skilled workers in the plant. So electricians and plumbers who are a big part of the plant, people who work in the plant, do cement and brickwork, painting. I'm not sure absolutely all the, I mean, I worked in an assembly plant for many years, but this was a long time ago. So, but many of the jobs are still the same. Electricians these days have to know much more about programming machines and that sort of thing than they used to. So some of the jobs in the plant, union jobs in the plant, are the same categories of jobs that you find workers in construction doing outside the plant. But even in building the plant and setting it up, millwrights, moving machinery, and hooking them up are involved in the plant, and whatnot. So there's a certain amount of overlap. It's not a totally different category of workers. But there are some differences, but they seem to have coordinated and worked well together, at least from the stuff that I've read. And yeah, housing was an issue, but I don't know enough about that to know what was going on. And in some of the, I mean, some of these, I mean, I've seen things, for example, in the Detroit area, and the Detroit area still has by far the largest amount of assembly and parts plants of any place in the country. I mean, it's not 95% like it used to be, but it's still much more than any place else in the country. And so housing was built for workers, and the workers are largely unionized in that area, even people working for Mitsubishi. And then the foreign companies, the Japanese companies, tend to bring in lots of engineers and management people from Japan. So, I mean, an interesting thing is near the Mitsubishi plant, downriver from Detroit, there were supposedly the best sushi places in that whole part of the country. And obviously they're catering to well-paid workers and engineers from Japan who are more discriminating than most U.S. Restaurant goers. So I assume that they build, like in the Detroit area, they build additional housing, and it's a large enough urban area that adding more housing is not the same issue as it is like in Georgetown or some of these small places. And I don't have the faintest idea what happens in a place like Vance with what 8,000 workers and obviously lots of management and engineering people as well.
Yeah, thank you. I saw a hand, last name Herman, but then it went away. Okay, perfect. We'll go here, and then there's a question in the chat that we'll get to after your question.
Thanks, Ajamo. Yeah, I'm Jan Herman. I'm sorry I had to miss last week. I had a conflict, but I'm really glad to be here tonight. I was particularly fascinated in the chapter 3 that we were reading for tonight about the existence and the power of the unemployed unions, which I frankly had never heard of. So I really want to understand a lot more about how they organized. How did they find one another when they didn't have a workplace to go to find one another? Was it bread lines or what? And I also really resonated with the point you make, Mr. Goldfield, in that chapter about how volatile they are because people kind of leave the union if they get a job. And I've been organizing over the last year, trying to start a chapter with a few other folks of the National Union of the Homeless, which was active in a large part of the country in the 80s and early 90s, and is revitalizing. And that same issue is there. People move in and out of housing. And so to organize as homeless people is also volatile. So we've been trying to strategize about an issue that's universal across all life experiences that poor people have, and have begun to build a network of a Medicaid army, people who are fighting for health access and health quality. So I just feel like the unemployed union people are our ancestors in today's movement, and I just really wanted to express appreciation for your lifting them up.
Yeah. So I'm not sure how much is applicable, but there were various dimensions under which the unemployed were organized. First of all, there were renters being expelled from their housing, and so unemployed people mobilized to stop the police from evicting people. Once people were evicted and their furniture was moved out, they often moved the furniture back in, and they had people who rehooked up the hot wired the electricity and turned the water on and that sort of thing. The other thing is there were lots of bread lines and soup kitchens, and a lot of recruitment was done from those type of areas. And I think similar things are possible, and maybe this is something that you've actually done, from shelters and places where people sleep. They had rallies in parks And there's a fair amount of literature. I mean, it's all over the place, but I try to pull a lot of it together for that chapter that you read today. And they had rallies and talks of homeless people in parks, and they gave out free food. They had food, which was a big attraction for a lot of people. And so they did a variety of different types of things in terms of trying to reach people who were unemployed. And later in the 1930s, when there was more work and support for unemployed people, they organized people on works project administration projects. So it's less visible today, but when I was a kid, you could see lots of sidewalks in schools which said, had a building block on it and said WPA 1936, right? And you could even see some sidewalks. And maybe some of you who or a little older remember some of that. And I occasionally, since I look for these sort of things, still see those sort of things around. And there are bridges too that they haven't fixed since they built them during that period. I guess those are some of the bridges that are starting to fall apart, right? So once the unemployed people were got relief jobs, people started organizing those people on relief. That was actually played a significant role in the organizing of the most difficult auto plant, which was the Ford River Rouge plant, which had tens of thousands of people, a internal police force of thugs of 8,000 people in the plant. And the way they got significant amount of support is that they organized unemployed Ford workers who got jobs in relief projects. And when they were called back to work, they were already union people. So, but they were very creative at the places they went to find the unemployed.
This is a great discussion and great questions. Keep them coming. We have two in the chat now. I'll start with the first one from Cal. In the present day, what kinds of non-union organizations in the South are currently poised to assist in union activities? And there's been some discussion under that comment too, but I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Well, this seems to me a question that people here should be answering. I mean, I can tell you what I think, but those of you who are on the ground probably have more contact with different types of organizations. There's voting rights organizations in many of the big cities in the South. There's a lot of things that I read about, and some of which I've seen, but I would ask people who have more experience in terms of getting support. And I think that the lesson is that you have to think creatively, right? You have to look at what organizations are mobilizing people and whether there's any common ground. I mean, I think one of the funny things is that people don't automatically, in most places, support labor rights and labor organizing or put it at the top of their list. So I think one has to extend out. But what do people here think? What do you see? What types of organizations are there where you are that might be joined?
Not all at once. William, did I see your hand? You're muted.
Yeah, I was just going to say healthcare. I don't know that it's done, as far as a universal, um, everybody in, nobody out healthcare system. But I mean, it's really common amongst, wealthier nations. I mean, we're the outlier. But the common thing about that, it's kind of like, we were talking about housing and how you had all this company housing. We especially see that in the South, where people, the mill towns, and we still have neighborhoods now that are becoming gentrified, but a lot of these old mill town houses. But the same thing in mining towns. But one of these things, these social determinants of health, like housing and healthcare, that affects everybody, I think are things that would, make demands for public goods. And it's too bad we haven't made those links stronger to labor, because labor has been the one group that's really pushed the hardest for a national health program. It's been years, but it would liberate labor. I mean, in some ways, it's like an automatic strike fund, and would definitely be a better health program if it was a public health program, instead of one where your employer has the coercive power of life and death essentially over you and your family. I think back even in your book, you talk some about associations, and I know that there's a lot of history of that, of workers and labor.
We lost you.
You went on mute.
That's okay. I can wait for an answer.
Yeah, so I think so I don't know what it is in cities or where people are in the South, but in Detroit and other places in Michigan, there were organizations of people pushing for getting rid of lead pipes and lead paint in houses. It seems to me there's a variety of social and community groups with single issues, and healthcare is certainly one of them. So the interesting thing about the example I gave from Oakland, that was something sporadic. Before Occupy Wall Street, there were no Occupy groups, but it seemed to have struck a nerve in Oakland, and there were tens of thousands of people mobilized to shut down the port in support of the longshore workers. But yeah, I think there are various single issue groups. I mean, I know I've seen references to voter rights groups in places throughout the South, particularly in cities, right? Georgia, Alabama. And there's also students. It seems to me that there are active student groups. I mean, I've been to places in the past where there were major sit-ins involving hundreds of students against the university using sweatshop labor to make the university sweatshirts and other paraphernalia, much of which came from abroad, with people who were in really terrible conditions. And so I think that's a common issue. And there are other issues in which the potential for students organizing is real.
And, to add on to what has been said in the chat under the question, some people, said civil rights organizations and progressive religious congregations are both potential allies. Some urge for, the relationship, especially in North Carolina, between tenant unions and labor unions. Some suggested worker centers, and there was a comment that workers' assemblies are created and designed to help with that kind of work, to think through those questions. Are there any other questions? There's one more in the chat. But sorry, if you hear it screaming in the back, it's my kid. But yeah, are there any other questions live on the floor? And then I'll go to the one in the chat. Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I had this thought about the question about what other associative power groups could we reach out to, in the context of the big investment in electric vehicles in the South, and electric vehicle manufacturing that's happening. Is there potential there for like solidarity with environmental groups, and is that a source of associative power, or are they? I mean, I know there are issues with electric vehicles in terms of like lithium mining and stuff that I don't know enough about, but I'm curious how much solidarity can be built there.
So there's actually that this is a while back, but there were some interesting coalitions in Louisiana, which was a center for chemical companies. There's a strip 50 or 60 miles long called Cancer Alley, where mostly foreign chemical companies were dumping hazardous waste, usually in African American communities, environmental racism. And so there was joint mobilizations by the unions and community groups around what these chemical companies were doing. And while there are some places where there's conflicts between environmental groups and unions, this was not one of them. And there was also the Oil, Atomic and Chemical Workers Union, which was a more quote unquote progressive union. So there were coalitions at the time that challenged the chemical companies, and the workers in the plant were their health was suffering from the same type of things that were harming the communities outside the plants. So there's a couple books and articles about this. So that's certainly one type of community union coalition.
Perfect. And there's some good commentary in the chat that people are putting forward, examples from Durham and the community support with the sanitation workers U150 campaign for higher wages. But I guess I'll turn to the last question and see what time is like after that, and then maybe leave room for announcements if people have interesting updates, that kind of thing. But someone asked, could you speak more about the Sharecroppers Union disbanding and many members joining the National Farmers Union to work on the broader movement on page 101? How did that come about? If I understand it correctly, it seemed like the NFU was more aligned with corporate interests and wealthy farmers, and they were certainly less militant and confrontational.
Yeah, so the sharecroppers are interesting. Sharecroppers had very little leverage. The farm industry was in crisis. In many cases, the sharecroppers were being expelled from their land. So it was a rearguard type of action. They organized in places where the white supremacist power structure and repression was extreme. They engaged in gun battles and whatnot. So some of this has to do, the initial largest organization in particularly in Alabama, was led by the communists. Later, broader organization, the sharecroppers and farmers, sharecroppers, tenants and farmers organization, which was a more moderate group organized across the South. And beginning with in the mid-1930s, as I talk about in a later chapter, the communists became much less radical, and they tried to join more mainstream organizations. They merged a lot of their political activities into the Democratic Party, supporting Roosevelt, and they got rid of some of their more militant organizations, which was one of which was the sharecroppers organization, which had been centered in Alabama and expanded to certain other states. So they pushed for merging it into the National Farmers Union, which was broader, included people who were not workers or individual farmers, but included corporate entities. So there's a certain amount of criticism and debate about whether they should have done that. But that's the main reason it happened, because of the change of line from the more militant so-called third period to the Popular Front period. And I mean, I talk about a little bit about that in a chapter that we didn't read, but it's a longer story. So I don't know if that answers your question that well.
Thank you for the response and for the questions. We have time for maybe one more question. So I'm opening it up again, and if you feel that you want to put in the chat, that's fine too. But also feel free to ask it here, and no pressure, because this might be the last question. So a little bit of pressure. No, I'm just kidding. But maybe one more question to send us off before we talk about next week and some other things. Katie?
Thank you. Mike, I was thinking when reading, but also during your presentation, you talked about some of the unions that would say no, that sort of, you, I think, rightly criticized some of the decisions not to have that additional support from community groups. But I'm curious in thinking about, what kinds of partnerships are available. Do you think that's because they were more, I know that they were examples from different historical periods, so there's maybe different answers, but were they, more centrist unions, not particularly progressive unions? Was it circumstance? And I think kind of looking forward, does that mean that your concept and idea of associational power is going to work better for some unions and types of groups than others?
Yeah, so I think that's true. Some unions are more open to outside support, but even the best of unions tend to have a certain conservative streak. If it's their own members, they have much more control. That's also why many unions don't like a union democracy, because you can't tell often what workers are going to do. I mean, I was at a place that started having wildcats, and of course the union hierarchy, this is the auto workers union, hated this stuff because they were not in control. So I think that becomes an issue, and it's partly an issue of control. So I think that, except in the periods of massive upsurge, when it's a life or death question for the union, as with these early 1934 strikes, or the longshore workers fighting for their survival and needed as many support from other unions and woodworkers and everybody else, that unions tend to be hesitant about doing that. And I think that's also what happened with I have an article that I wrote within the last year about new books on longshore, and the administration of the longshore union during this time when Occupy took place was more conservative and less militant than previous administrations had been. But even under Harry Bridges, who had been communist leader of the union, they had debates in the union about whether they should be supporting the student movement in the 60s, when it's clear that, particularly in the San Francisco area, that this was a basis for extra support. So I think these questions become iffy for a lot of unions, and it's sort of like, what's the cliche? Cutting off your nose to spite your face. That they didn't accept the support that was there and could have made them stronger.
Nice. Thank you for the question, Katie, and thank you for the questions and engagement from everyone. Mike, I don't know how you're feeling. It's 8:07. We might have time for one more, or if you want to go into prep for next week, we could do that. But I gotta my instincts are telling me there's a burning question out there from the engagement, so I don't want to close it off. But I'll defer to you what you think is best.
No, I'm right. So I'm used to, from teaching, giving these 3-hour lectures and having people interrupt me and all that sort of stuff. So I'm happy to keep talking or listening and fielding questions as long as people are willing to do it.
You all heard the man.
So
Okay. Well, there's,
so there's nothing burning.
yeah, I don't think so. I think my instincts were wrong, but there are some good comments in the chat, like for the question around the environment and workers. Dan Taylor putting something about an organization he works for, Blue Green Alliance, that seeks to bring together labor and environmental groups. There were Al Long put in about some future associative power with the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And how many in the Palestine Solidarity Movement are seeing the role that labor is playing and seeing an alliance with the U.S. working class. So yeah, this is some good comments. People are engaging in the chat, bringing forward, lots of ideas, lots of thoughts, lots of comments. So that's good. And so as we, prepare for next week, I want to say bring the same energy. And the reading will be on Operation Dixie, a topic that the SWA has had some conversations about before. So if you were a part of those conversations and you have some questions that weren't resolved from those, bring those to the discussion, because Operation Dixie is very important, and our guest, the author, will be able to have some really good insights about what it means, its legacy, and its importance. And with 5 minutes left, I know that many of you are active in your workplace and your community. So I was curious to know what's some news, what's some possible good news, what's some strides you all are making in your workers' assembly, your workplace, that you might want to share with others on the call across the South. Leave on a good motivational note. And I had the thought of maybe we go around, everybody say, one thing, but that's not the vibe here. But I hope people do share some good news. What's happening on your job, in your community. Okay, Chelsea, anything happening on the environmental front in your place? Okay, William.
Yes, I was just going to say, I'm here in Western North Carolina and Asheville and just south of here, Hendersonville. CWA workers are on strike all week, all day. So I'm going to try and jump in on that tomorrow and show some solidarity with those guys. I just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
Nice, nice. Thanks for sharing. Jody, anybody else? Any good news in the workplace? Russ, Katie?
So in Rocky Mount on the 1st of September, there'll be a meeting about, it's called Not One Death More from heat deaths for farm workers.
Hmm.
And the farm workers, because they don't have their own transportation, need rides to that meeting. So that's a good place for some associative power to show up.
Mm-hmm. Nice, nice. If we can get to Rocky Mount, let's try and get there. Jody, then Russ.
Yeah, some of us in North Carolina are launching a monthly newsletter for construction workers in North Carolina in English and Spanish. So we're rolling that out this month, which is exciting.
Beautiful, beautiful. Russ, Brother Gilbert, you're muted.
I went to the CWA picket line, and there will be more people going to CWA picket lines tomorrow. And we're trying to find out if they're going to have any activity over the weekend. But I'm interested in what the brothers from Asheville thinks about what I read, about the hospital worker situation, or the nurses, I should say, in Asheville, because there was a report on MSNBC or some major media saying they were getting ready to take a strike vote. Since very few hospital workers are organized in North Carolina, I think it's something that we should be following.
Nice. William?
Yes, mission nurses will be voting later this month over a 3-4 day period it's a strike vote to determine if they're going to go on strike. I've been on the picket line with those guys every time they've been out front, but they're officially going to vote to strike, and hopefully they'll have a majority. And if they choose to go on strike, they're up against a tough battle against HCA, who owns Mission Hospital now. Because of their greed. Mission Hospital here in Asheville is their second most profitable hospital in the United States, and they've got several hospitals here in the United States. So yeah, I'll definitely be keeping an eye on that, and it'd be interesting to see if they do go ahead and vote to strike.
Nice. Well, we're at 8:14, close to 8:15. Comrades and friends from across the South, this has been really good. I think it was good for us to end about what's happening in some workplaces to ensure that, we're looking at this history. We're having these deep conversations about what happened, but the primary objective is to really, really ensure it's embedded in the work that we're doing. We're taking this history and we're reflecting on our present organizing and using it to help organize at the highest stage possible. So as you read the chapter about Operation Dixie, raise those questions. Think about your workplace. Read from that perspective. What lessons need to come out? So Mike, I don't know if you have any closing remarks, but we're back same time next week to talk about Operation Dixie. In the meantime, support the CWA, support workers everywhere. Let's stay in contact. Let's keep pushing forward. And thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I assume Ben's going to post them. I have a set of questions about the readings and its relevance to today, so that might give some direction to reading of the chapter on our Operation Dixie. So Ben, I assume you'll send that out to people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we may also send along, as the Jamu mentioned, the SWA has held some discussions on Operation Dixie, and some have written some stuff about Operation Dixie as well that we may add into the mix that are short. It's like, I think 5 to 7 pages, as part of the discussion for next week. So we'll definitely send that out, to folks in the next couple days. But it's chapter 7, and there are recordings of these sessions. I was gonna edit them all and send it out as a batch, but so after the third one, so we'll get that to folks probably right around Labor Day.
Very fitting. Perfect timing.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody's comments, and hopefully see you all next week.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Mike. Thank all.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Night.